Good evening, everyone. We're delighted that Rahul Mehrotra has agreed to do this lecture on his latest book, Working in Mumbai, for us at Prakriti Foundation. Welcome to all of you who have joined from different parts of the country as well as the world. And I think that is perhaps one of the joys of doing events on Zoom. I'm going to introduce Rahul, who really doesn't need an introduction, but as a formality, just for some of you who may not know some of his details. Rahul Mehrotra is the founder, principal of RMA Architects. He divides his time between working in Mumbai and Boston and teaching at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he is the Professor of Urban Design and Planning and the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization. This book, Working in Mumbai, is a sort of reflection on his over 3 decades of practice, where he looks at what his work and the intersections of his engagement with architecture have been through the lens of the city of Bombay or Mumbai. For those of you who would be interested in purchasing the book and for certain discount details, they are on the chat. Please feel free to go through that. It's a great book. I do have a copy. Also, for those of you who'd like to ask questions, please do post them on the Q&A. And so as soon as Rahul is done sharing his talk with us, we will have some time for questions. With that and without further ado, welcome Rahul, and over to you.
Thank you, Ranveer. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to do this for you, do this for the Prakriti Foundation. It's bringing back amazing memories of maybe over 10 years ago when you and the Visual Arts Center, the Hutti Singh Center in Ahmedabad, launched my book, Architecture in India. And I want to start with that because, I have on the screen, as you can see, Architecture in India, which was published by Pictor, who also had published my first book, Bombay Cities Within, and this latest book, because I believe that writing, research, and this is something we'll talk about in a little further in the presentation, they are continuities. They build on each other. These ideas are connected. And, to see these connections and to articulate them, I think become very important. And the real twin for this new book is Architecture in India, because Architecture in India was a reflection on the profession since 1990, which is the year we started our practice. And this 10 years after that book, so 30 years, that kind of captured 20 years of the practice, but it also coincided with India liberalizing its economic policies. And this one is 30 years of practice and reflecting. In that book, we didn't write about our own work, or I didn't write about my own work, because I kind of chose to, wear the hat of a critic and look at what surrounded me, what was the context in which one had actually been practicing for 2 decades. And this one has sidestepped and actually in the first person talked about one's own reflections. So in a sense, they are a pairing. They are structured very similarly. If you put them together, they really look like a pair, and they're intended to be that. And I wanted to kind of say that at the offset, especially for those of you who are familiar with the book, Architecture in India. So here in this book, it's structured very much like Architecture in India. It's broken into 4 or 5 parts. It is a combination of, very text-heavy essays with also very much visual material. And as at the offset of the book, I say this is not a monograph because it's intended to be a reflection. It's to the extent one can walk that line where one can, describe one's own work, but also be reflective and self-critical about it, what is, called single and double loop thinking, where you're in the problem and outside it simultaneously, and that you can go back and forth. And for me, that's a very exciting position, because it tests your honesty. It also, forces you to kind of think and reflect critically. And that allows you to kind of discern all sorts of patterns, which if you didn't get engaged with the single and double loop thinking, it's hard to kind of really do. But it also allows you, when you're talking in the first person, almost as a reflection, to also reflect about failure, which I think is quite critical for us to do, to learn. Now, the book, as I said, is not a monograph. It is a critical reflection of practice. And these essays, which this is just the preface of the book. It's many pages. I'm just showing you through this presentation samples through the book. And here I kind of explain why architecture in India and contextualizing that broader landscape was important. And the very particular things that, one discussed in that book. One was this idea that if you remove the lens of modernism, because we tend to see contemporary architecture in India only through the lens of modernism. So you had Louis Kahn, you had Corbusier, and how generations have extended that tradition, broadly speaking. But what's happening on the ground is quite different. And so by removing that lens of modernism, one saw a whole landscape. One had to understand a building like Akshardham, for example, in much greater detail, or to understand what global capital was doing to our landscape. One also sort of discusses why and how, when aesthetic modernity arrives here before the social modernization project, what are the disjunctures that exist, both aesthetically and otherwise. And so there are many issues like that that are discussed in this preface. It's a preface, it opens. After the preface comes really the book. And in the book, one has divided it into 4 parts. One is called The Architecture of the Interior, because, I felt the interior is the route that most of us, when we are young and we start and we are practicing, that's the route. And how can one pose that differently from interior decoration, which is also important, but therefore one has positioned it as the architecture of the interior. Then the question of the rural and the urban, because we are kind of oscillating in our commissions between these different landscapes, doing weekend homes, which are kind of in a rural landscape, but then also building and dealing and grappling with very contested issues within the urban. The third one is the notion of constructing cultural significance, which is really my take on conservation, preservation, what that means within the Indian context. And then the fourth is it's about, again, a binary and how you resolve this, which is what is local and what is global. And should one stick with the binary, or should one diffuse it in more interesting ways? And then the last one is a reflection of the practice and much more information on the practice. So the way the book is structured is that each one of these chapters has an extensive, ranging from 6 to 12, 13,000 word essay, which interrogates really these questions that I've just very briefly summarized for you. And then it has a portfolio of 5 to 10 projects which begin to perhaps explain at least, or begin to explain how we have responded to the same questions that I've articulated. And sometimes, not successfully, and sometimes successfully, but that is part of the fun of writing a book like this, because it's self-reflective. And so in the architecture of interiors, there are many projects, but essentially to kind of, interrogate this idea, like I said, how does one make the architecture of the interior? One of my professors, Professor Raja, had once, when he saw the early work we were doing, he said, what I enjoy seeing your interior works is that you confront the architecture. You peel off every layer to the raw architecture and then start doing the interior. And that made us very self-conscious of that approach, which one had been doing intuitively. And one then actually built on it, which led us into recycling buildings, led us into conservation. It came from confronting the architecture of the interior. And I just thought that experience one must capture. So this is, I'm giving you a sample of this chapter of the book. We began to work with older spaces, peeling off layers, finding under vinyl floors, beautiful Minton tiles, getting very excited about going to the rawness of the building in its original state. What you see very small here is an image of the Jahangir Art Gallery. And for me, the person who really understood the space was Hussein, who did this wonderful installation just using white paper and cloth, and he took the whole gallery over. And so the whole idea there was, how does one alter these interiors in the way that people confront them differently? And that began to lead us into trying to, create correlations between what we were studying historically. This is the Dockyard Road in Mumbai, and how that began to now, in reflection, even influence the way we were articulating space. In this case, it was an office we put in within the attic of an old Gothic building, but without touching the bones of the building. And this was like a series of objects that sat within the larger attic. And so then recycling the first Sakshi Art Gallery in the Bombay Milllands. I think this was the first project in the Milllands where a space was recycled, and I'm now talking 25 years ago, etc. And so this essay talks about what that idea of confronting the architecture of the interior means. And then there's a portfolio of projects. So this is the Jahangir Art Gallery, where in fact one had a very difficult brief, which was how can it work as 3 galleries and 1 gallery, and serve many purposes with only one entrance, because of Samovar was along one edge and the entrance couldn't occur from there. And so one created this space where artists would be confronted with organizing space differently. I think for some artists it worked beautifully, for some it was a disaster. And that's why I love the way Hussein responded to it. But we also began to recycle other older spaces and kind of convert them. And that's how we began to get interested in conservation, because we were going down to the ultimate layers of the building, the original layers of the building, and getting excited by those textures and patinas one was discovering. It was also a time when India, as we liberalized our economy, it meant retail and many other operations like that began to come to the forefront. And there were brands that would send you details and you built your shop based on that. And we were very fortunate to, with Archana Shah from Ahmedabad, the bandage stores and her line of bandage, we worked with her to kind of develop what might be a different aesthetic for that. And this was the first bandage in Ahmedabad. When we landed up then doing actually a handbook for her, where it was a kit of parts that could be adapted for any shop, which kind of responded, to really the needs of her product, which was very rich traditional fabrics with many colors and very hard to display together. And therefore, how does one actually almost make it painterly in the way these colors and light refracts through glass? So we began to use glass, I think, in interesting ways to separate display so that different products could be arranged. And it was a handbook which could be applied, and we applied it over 4 or 5 shops. And similarly, restaurants. This is Swati Snacks in Mumbai, 2 outlets that we did, where we kind of experimented with this notion of glass, but also privacy, where food was not visible. People could yet look out. Views were framed, which are very precious in a place like Mumbai. And what you see in this plan is very interesting, because it's a fold out of the plan, elevation sections and the ceiling. And that was kind of dealt with as a composition in itself. So it was like wrapping around something in the space. Now, I'm emphasizing all this because within the architecture of the interior, it is also a crucible for innovation, because actually we do all our experiments at the finest scale in these interiors. And so therefore that notion of experimentation, because it allows you in a very controlled manner at a small scale to innovate. And those ideas then, I think, travel and also become, seeds for bigger ideas in other projects. And so I just want to kind of make the point that the interior, which is the route that we all follow, if looked at differently and confronting the architecture, it can actually become a very productive venue for all of us when we are starting our practices. And for many of you younger architects who are listening to this, it can be taken very seriously as an extension of the practice of architecture. The second section of this book really looks at the notion of the city in the village, which is urban people building in the rural landscape. We call them weekend houses, we call them farmhouses, whatever, but it is actually urban people with a kind of urban sophistication actually intervening really in a rural landscape where there are disparities. Sometimes there's no water for most of the people who live there, but then we build rather, plush houses there. So how does one confront that? And then the other side of it is living in the Indian city, which is how does one actually make that a viable proposition? How does one make living there pleasurable too, given the constraints, of what our cities sort of impose on the kind of commissions we do. So again, this is an essay that tries to understand what is happening in urbanization in India. I'm just showing you 2 pages, but these go into 8 or 10 pages. They're long essays, which begin to bring our own reflections about this and how we dealt with architecture in this location. And then this is really, the portfolio of projects. Some of our early projects here, in this case in Alibag, how one uses local materials, how one addresses the notion of weathering, where the base of the building is stone, which might last for 100 years, but the roof and other things are made in lighter materials, which can be changed every 20 years, 25 years, and even modified as the needs for these houses change. And then how one can use spaces like courtyards, how one can actually let the building interface with nature. In this case, a project where the living room was this big porch, where they could, the clients in this case could, the few days they were there for the weekend, could sit in this open porch. And in a sense, when they went away, that porch, you see 2 taps of water there because the roof collects all the water, becomes an offering to the caretaker and his family who are from the local village. And so therefore then using even moving from interiors to smaller architecture, actually each of these became projects where we also bought an agenda, not that we were hiding that agenda from the client, but we actually were engaging the client in discussing these issues that, look, if you're not going to be using this for more than 50 days in a year, how could we make this more transparent and usable for the caretaker, who could then hang out here? Therefore, the house is safe. And it also becomes another kind of soft threshold, as I described. And so we've done a number of projects which sort of experiment with this idea of visual porosity, if nothing else, rather than isolating and exaggerating the binary that exists when urban people build in rural areas. And then, of course, within that whole gamut, there's also experimentation with material, and how things are put together with local material, which is extremely exciting. But also issues like, when urban people build in rural areas, you kind of create a polarity just because of the hedonism that people engage with when they're building in these places. So you go weekend home, pool, so there's this, it's a form of ostentation. And so therefore then how can one make all that more discreet? So in this case, how the pool becomes the heart of the house. But if you look at that image on the left, it's very discreet from the outside, but yet quite pleasurable and beautifully articulated within. And so therefore one can kind of make both conditions coexist. And so therefore these houses, I believe, become venues in a sense to play some of those ideas out. And I think it's a scale that even with patrons or clients, in this case, or clients, patrons, and I'm going to come to that issue, will also understand other ways, because architecture is really, society invests in us to imagine better spatial possibilities in which we can live our lives out. And so these questions become very important if one thinks of the larger context. And then, of course, when one is building in the city, it's a different set of issues. This is one of our favorite houses, which is in Chennai. It's a corner house. And it really was a very interesting client, but it was also a very interesting set of issues that with this client we could really engage with. That is, how does a house be discreet yet have presence on a corner? How does one negotiate the corner? How does one embody the house also with many abstracted experiences of what might be experienced in kind of traditional configurations of space? And again, this notion that the pool was discrete, but it also became very much an integral part of the house, and actually had a double coding, which means it could mean different things at different times. Here, it also was very interesting because the ground itself we played with. The ground, even the terrace became the ground. And here you see a lotus pond with the puja room. On the other side, you see a garden which becomes like a sculpture court. And so it began to challenge and reverse many business as usual kinds of norms of what a house would be. And it began to walk a very thin line between what might be a home, but also one can transform it into venues for bigger gatherings. And, you know, one of the most beautiful moments was when it was used in this way, where the courtyard was set up for music performances on this island, which was designed for something like that. And the house begins to take on a completely different presence. Is it an institution? Is it a house? Because things slide and open and expand, and it's interesting. And so therefore, how can then one use these venues, which are venues which, at least from our perspective, when you're young, these houses are now 20 years old or more, they allow you the luxury to begin to ask these questions. And if you don't ask those questions, then you lose an opportunity. The client loses an opportunity, because, you know, otherwise we say, okay, we're going to do interiors in some houses till we get a big project. But it doesn't happen like that. It is an evolutionary process, and it's ideas. And that's why even with the books, I started by saying these are pairings. These don't come out of the blue. These are evolutionary processes, as are design ideas. And I think writing and articulating them are ways that we become conscious of the continuity of those ideas. And that is really, I think, very critical, which is the heart of the spirit in which one has done this book. Or in Delhi, this project, which was interesting, it was a small plot, and now the FSI was very high, and so they could build 3 apartments, and each sibling wanted an apartment. So it was, you know, 3,600 square feet was the total FSI. It was a very long, narrow plot, and we had to do 1,200 square feet for each of the families. And each apartment has different requirements. They're all duples and triples, and they interlock in very complex ways, but they're exactly 1,200 square feet each. And within them, they have shafts, which become courtyards, and they kind of evoke, in some ways, the sensibilities that one might experience in a traditional house in old Delhi, perhaps even. And therefore, there's a whole series of different staircases, because the section of the house is complex at each level, but the facade is also designed for green to grow. This next section is on conservation, which is called Constructing Cultural Significance. This is the longest essay, because I think I had the most to say here, because it is also a complex issue. There's a kind of range of things that we've got in the portfolio, but it's an essay that really seriously tries to, take the idea of cultural significance and understand it better. Really, the issues here are how do we engage with conservation where we are also agents of change? We're not just people who oppose change, because I believe that conservation is an instrument. It's actually a planning instrument that every society has, and unfortunately, it's moved so away from planning and become a activity in itself that it's problematic. It is an instrument of planning that allows any society to modulate the rate of change. And different societies at different times in their evolution can deal with change in different ways, as the Chinese did during the Cultural Revolution in dramatic ways. Now they're also slowing down. Or England, on the other hand, living in nostalgia of a lost empire, can't yet grapple with change, right? And so and in India, it's even more complicated, as I say, where the word kal means yesterday and tomorrow. We think simultaneously of the future and the past, and we live it seamlessly. What does conservation mean? And so that is one of the important issues that I've tried to discuss here, but also what in a place like Mumbai it means to be in a post-colonial time, now, many years, 75, but where the creators of an environment were, in this case, the British, and now we are the custodians of that environment, the narratives have to be completely different. We can't use the narratives that English heritage or the British might give us in the rhetoric of conservation. We need to develop our own narratives. And therefore, the idea of how do you construct a significance where you can keep the illusion of the architecture and the urban fabric, but imbue it with new meaning. And so the work we did with the Kala Ghoda area and the fort area, and trying to reinvent these new uses which would drive the conservation process was something that we've looked at. But we've, of course, also dealt with issues of authenticity, of materiality, and all of that in this essay too. But we've also kind of ended the essay with speculating what does it mean for our modern heritage, which is also very important. It marks our independence, it marks our embracing modernism, it marks the legacy of Nehru. It's just many things. And I think this is what your generation or the next generation for me is going to confront, which is how does one actually create that significance and create the narratives which can fly in the popular imagination, because these are also very important buildings. And so then in the portfolio, we have shared all the work we've done, conservation reports, the Prince of Wales Museum, conservation reports we've done for the Rajabai Tower very early on in 93 or 2, before any of the work started. It was the foundational conservation report. The Prince of Wales Museum, which we've been involved with for many years, 2 decades now. We've also done additions there. And this whole idea how in a heritage zone, one can also do contemporary interventions while keeping the integrity of the buildings intact, and the transformation of the annex from a warehouse into 50,000 square feet of space. And how does one respond to these elements? How does one make new interventions that are reversible? The visitor center and the children's museum, the visitor center can be dismantled, in a few days. It's all done in steel, which is welded or screwed on. But how does one make these interventions, which are very contemporary, very low-key, which don't disturb the integrity of the fabric, but also bring up new ideas? And then, of course, there are more serious conservation projects, which is a management plan for the Taj Mahal, where we've I've kind of in the book articulated the process where a whole new collaborative was set up, consultants were set up. Here you see the late Martan Singh in this image, Bernard Fielden, who was the chair of the committee that advised on this, and many workshops that happened. So all those experiences have been captured in terms of process and protocol, authenticity of materials, questions like that, but also smaller projects. In this case, a bungalow on the left from the 1840s in Ahmedabad, which has been restored as a home, but restored yet making contemporary interventions. And more recently, a project that we really love, which is the Lal Bhai Museum, where it was a compound, which means it was a house with many other components, like an outhouse, a staff quarters, a kitchen, and how one kind of attempted, or one was very inspired, let's say, to create this dialogue between the old and the new, but in ways that it extends it into the modern times. And so the bungalow itself was restored, and you can see in the site plan the different components, and at the bottom of the site plan you see a completely new intervention. The rest were about recycling, but also the question of how, and in this case the clients were very keen that it doesn't lose the spirit of a home, and so they very, very sensitively kind of placed old furniture and artwork as it was used when it was a living space. And then through that veranda you see a new intervention which was actually put partly underground, so it became a garden, so it was respectful of the old building. And then these are the different components that were recycled: staff quarters, kitchens, which became different kinds of art spaces. So it gives you a spectrum. And here you see how by sitting underground, you yet frame the old building, but are respectful of it. The next section, which is really the last section before we talk about the practice, is this notion of mediating the local and the global, which is how do you localize the global, which is how do you take the capital that can come from anywhere and make it committed to a place. And I think architecture can play a big role in doing this. And similarly, how do you take what might be very local programs, things for slum dwellers or, very particular rural conditions in India, but how do you take that and articulate it in a way that those lessons and those issues resonate more globally, because otherwise we'll end up making a caricature of the local in a bid to reinforce the identity of the local. And I think that's a mistake. Then you get stuck in the binary. And I think these projects here have attempted to. So this is an essay which looks at that. It looks at corporate buildings or new typologies, or we've got a software project for HP in Bangalore. How do you take these global programs that actually imply a certain identity and image, a kind of image of a global architecture. And how do you actually localize it? And so I want to share with you two projects here. There are many projects in this section, but I want to just share two. One was a project we did, we finished in 1996. We started designing it in 1994. It was headquarters for Lakshmi Machine Works in Coimbatore. And, you know, our practice was only 3 or 4 years old. This was a 100,000 square foot corporate office. The clients were very low-key about it. They didn't want it published, so we respected that totally. And so it was an aberration in the practice because we kept doing interiors and small houses for the first 10 years, but in the middle of all of this, suddenly we had done this big project. And here we really, you know, the first brief we got for them was 7-story high glass building. We have a vendor in Australia who's going to bring the curtain glazing in, and, you know, it seemed like a clear formula for a corporate headquarter. But we kind of, you know, I don't know, we didn't have the confidence then, but we managed to move it in another direction, which is now in reflection, I can say it more clearly, which I wasn't so clear about then, is that when we are globalizing in a way, we should be even more confident about what lies within our tradition. And so we really used more, because Coimbatore sits on the sort of the border of Kerala and Tamil Nadu. It's in the rain shadow, so it's a hot, dry climate, but, you know, the Nilgiri hills get a lot of rain, Kerala gets a lot of rain. So it was trying to combine the kind of lessons one could get from both sides of that geography and walk this thin line. And it landed up being like a 7-story building, but lying on its back, because it became a building with a series of courtyards. You entered in a large courtyard, a car could drive in it. And then as you went through the building, as you see in the section, the courtyards got very intimate. And it was a 20,000 square foot roof that was held. And you see that in plan. The water was also used to circulate in the courtyards to cool it, because it's a hot, dry climate. But I think one of the most interesting aspects of this building were twofold. One was that the clients wanted to invest in art. And by doing a building like this, it was impossible to make spaces for art unless they were in the conference room. And so with the client, they involved Rajiv Sethi, and collectively we put a team of artists together with Rajiv's help, who, you know, was someone more senior to us, but had access to many of these sorts of crafts, that we got a series of artists to work on the building elements like the jalis, the railings, the seating. This is an installation done by Rajiv Sethi himself, where conferences could happen in the veranda. It was all single loaded corridors of circulation, always looking into a courtyard. They're never double loaded. And so that every room had natural ventilation. There are 7 companies within the larger group that are all housed in this building. So it's about collective identity, but it's also, each one has their own individual access. And so these are the courtyards with the water going through, waterfalls. Manjit Bawa took his figures and translated them into embossed copper, which became the railings. Rajiv Sethi did this flag with, you know, with Lakshmi's, which is the motif of the company, embossed in them. And so it was a wonderful collaborative effort. Yogesh Rawal with Rajiv Sethi went into the machine tool factories, and they picked up all the scrap metal. And then using the scrap metal, they created a whole array of jalis. And, you know, I'm often told it's beautiful tribal art, and then I don't have the heart to tell people it's just scrap metal. But it's so beautiful because it allows people who work in the company to actually touch the material that gives them the wealth. So it's kind of brings the factory in a way to the corporate office. And it reverses at night in terms of how you know, the profile or the silhouette of the jali becomes clear. And it was interesting, this was 96, so 97 was 50 years of India's independence. And as a homage, the palette of colors in the building were the flag colors of the Indian flag. And that became the way we kind of really made that tribute at 50, which is full of excitement. Now we are embarking on 75. And I don't have a sense, because I've not been there for a few months, of how much that excitement is. But there were also things about, you know, software companies and many other things. And then the last building within this section I just want to show you is a building in a completely different context, which is in Basel in Switzerland. And this is a very interesting campus. Novartis has a campus, that's their headquarters. And this is, I think, the 18th or the 19th building. And they have buildings by architects from around the world, Frank Gehry, Alvaro Siza, Edward Sotomora, Markey, many others, Rafael Moneo, Frank Gehry. I think we were asked from India, because they were looking for architects in India, to do this building, which was in 2010. It's called the Lab of the Future. And it was very interesting project, because the kind of brief we got was a very standard lab. But I think the learnings all the way from our interiors to homes to questioning how people interact in space, I think led to a completely different configuration. So of course the outer skin and the volume one can't touch, because that's the guidelines they have for all the buildings. But you see this series of diagrams where we completely questioned the way a lab works, and instead of having two big shafts, which is how they do, we kind of fractured it all, the circulation, the shaft, which means we got a very clear space in between. And the other thing we did was we said that the labs need, a higher ceiling and the offices need a lower ceiling. So on the side the offices are, we can get more floors, which means then once we consume that FSI, we can carve out a courtyard in the center of the building, which becomes a space of interaction between the scientists and the administrators, which was a big problem in many of the other buildings. And so we experimented with a green facade on one side. On the other side, it overlooks the Rhine River, where there are automated louvers, there are courtyards and double heights within. On the facade itself, the facade is a register of the climate and the weather, in a sense, the many seasons, or not weather, but the many seasons. And so Gunther Woh, who is a Zurich-based landscape architect, actually designed the facade for us as a register. So you see in different seasons how the colors on the facade change. And then within the building is the greenhouse and the courtyard with many split levels, which become places for meetings. The conferences happen now in that garden, but that garden also becomes like a greenhouse, which allows the building to be heated and cooled. And so all the public spaces, the decks here, the decks down here, are all the meeting spaces at the center of the building, so that the two constituencies in the building who otherwise don't interact actually come together. We also have institutional projects. This is a library for CEPT in CEPT University in Ahmedabad, where we felt we were building in a historic, modern heritage complex or campus. And so it was a 6-story building that was in the brief. And the way we responded to is put half the building underground. And it was a very difficult site, because these are the many of the existing buildings, and we were given a site next to the VAC, the Hutti Singh Visual Arts Center, which is, a building, but of a completely different scale. And so negotiating all of that, we, really had to struggle with how we make all this compatible, and going below the ground by 3 floors was a challenge, but a way to solve this problem. But also there were many other advantages of doing that, of keeping the building cool, of segregating the many uses. And this is all sort of described in great detail, in the book. And as you go down 3 floors, natural light percolates, and you always have views on the diagonal, because there are different sectional logics for the 3 buildings that form this one building, and therefore it expands your view. So it's lessons like that I think even come from very small projects that then begin to find themselves in larger projects. And this one, again, these are now, how does one localize, or how does one make the local global? And this is for a campus for Magic Bus, which is really an organization that takes slum children to Panvel, to this campus where they do recreation and all of that. And what we set ourselves the goal here as a research project was, let's look at what are the materials slums are made from, what are the materials these kids will have familiarity with, but let's take those materials and reconfigure them. And here the utopian ideal was that these kids would see how these materials, the ordinary materials they live with, can be reconfigured in other ways. So as they become teenagers and they grow older, they might actually begin to modify their homes in that time, or get involved with building if they were more mobile economically, or if governments had better policies, etc. So again, to use architecture instrumentally in this way, and a whole series of buildings using all those same materials of corrugated metal, this is GI sheets, etc., which then we translated into a community toilet for Spark, for Sheila Patel's group, which, again, I've described, many of it failed. So one is reflected upon the failure, but there's a continuity of ideas here, which one wants to actually highlight. And then a low-cost housing project for elephants and mahouts, which was really a landscape project, which was very interesting because it was complex. It was government agencies, it was us, it was the users and the mahouts. And so we kind of mapped the story of the project in terms of who the players were, how they interrelated with each other, and describe that in the book. And I'm going to summarize that really at the end of these next 10 minutes. So the last chapter, which is the context as generator of the practice, is a reflection really of these 4 chapters, but also trying to intersect my other activities like my involvement with the Urban Design Research Institute, the conferences, lectures, exhibitions, what they have meant, how they have been tools of reflecting about things. So the State of Architecture, which I did with Kaivan Mehta and Ranjit Hoskote, how that really picked up on architecture in India since 1990 and took it somewhere else. But there was a kind of continuity, and again became a tool in a sense for advocacy. And then the various books and the kind of taxonomy there, books on Mumbai, books on urbanism, how they kind of relate to each other and how they've informed our work. And the last section is a book in itself, which is about 40 pages, 40 double spreads, which looks at a chronology of 200 projects from 1990. But it also intersects the projects with publications, exhibitions, teaching, and other affiliations, which are indexed. So for me, this was actually very educative, because retrospectively one saw what one was doing when one was building these houses, but was also working on conservation legislation, or was working on conservation project and writing these, but doing also houses. Sometimes the aesthetics are very different. I'll never forget when we did a book on the High Court, a client came in and said, "We saw your book on the High Court, we want you to do a Gothic house for us." And I thought, no, that's not what we do. So this helped me clarify the idea that many of these engagements can be simultaneously valid. We don't have to be tied up by living in one world or the other. We can live and habit many worlds simultaneously. And in a place like India, that is very productive as an attitude, because it allows you to make the connections, the bridges, because we are bridge practitioners. We are practices or architecture, urban design, urban planning, landscape architecture. These are about connecting parts of society, not distancing them. And therefore, the simultaneous validity of these various activities, I think, becomes quite critical. And so it's very exhaustive by year, which tells you what was happening when. There's some years where there's more building, as in this case, or there's some years where there's more writing and very little building. So all of that becomes quite manifest. And then the last is a homage to the studio, where we have mapped everyone who worked in the office, what their role was, how long they worked, whether they were associates or interns or model makers or administrators. So this chart is actually very interesting. You take anyone and you can tell when they worked, who else was working, and how long they worked, and what their contributions were. So if you relate their years here to the chronology, you know exactly what they were involved with in their presence there. So I'm going to end this with just 2 more minutes, Ranveer and Meera, of reflecting. So, what does one learn from this? If I have to extract 5 or 6 things, what might they be? One is, I think we, have to think about the architecture of practice. What is the armature we set up as practitioners within which we can practice? It's not just practicing architecture, but it's actually first designing the architecture of that practice. The second is, I think it's very critical that we complicate what we imagine as the context, which is the context is material. Some of us are more ambitious and say, let's look at excavated histories. What is the culture of that landscape? But otherwise it's climate, material, client brief, etc. But you complicate it by putting that context in its context. And that context is a much larger context, which is social, economic, cultural, changing all the time. And therefore, then you begin to anticipate, which means you begin to say, yeah, I've got a brief I'm designing today, but the context of the context tells me that this is transforming incredibly. There are going to be high-rise buildings around here. This is going to happen. This is why it's happening. How can I anticipate that? Of course, it complicates our life, but it's a very important question to ask, to nuance what we do. And then from that, I think it's critical that we don't live in one of these worlds. We don't become the architects of the informal or the architects of the formal, and we're only working with developers or institutions, but we should be able to do both simultaneously, whether it's the state and the private. There are people who say, oh, I'm never going to do a government job, but then that doesn't help you change, the temperature in a sense, right? So you have to make up or make a decision that to blur these binaries, we can't be just thermometers. We have to be thermostats where we can change the temperature. And therefore, the only way to do that is to really aspire towards blurring these binaries, making the spaces that can help these binaries blur, not reinforcing these binaries. The next couple of things was, this was, buildings like Hathigao and many other projects we've done recently in Ahmedabad made me really think hard about this, that we simplify the idea of the client. We say, okay, I have a client and the client wants this. That's not the right way to maybe pose it, because I think a client is also a complicated entity. So in a single family house, well, so let me say, just for simplicity, you have a patron client, someone who has a vision, perhaps the finances, perhaps a larger intent. Then you have the operational client who, could be the person who implements. So it could be the public works department, or it could be, in the case of our Hathigao project, the Amber Development Authority, the tourism, etc. Or it could be the campus engineer, the campus committee, if you're building on a campus, that is, represented the provost and some faculty members, etc. And then the users are the people who actually use it. So it would be in a campus, the faculty and the students. Actually, each one of these clients have different aspirations. We land up aligning with one or the other, which means either we feel we have great access to the patron. So if I run into problems, I'm just going to the patron and they will solve it for me. And that happens successfully very often. Or you align with the campus engineer and you're very pragmatic. You make it all happen in such a way that it's just simple to do. Or you become part of the users and then you become an activist and you're sometimes confronting the client, and maybe sometimes all of that is legitimate. But really, if we think of ourselves as bridge disciplines or bridge practitioners, our job is really to bring those aspirations all on the same side of the table in a way, because then you have a product that might sustain. Now, I'm not saying every project we've done meets all those criteria, we've failed, but in retrospect, I've realized by identifying this, it already puts you in a space of course, there are trade-offs, and those trade-offs is what you have to skillfully manage. Now, in a single family house, which we all love doing, weekend homes and single family, that friction reduces, because except for the differences between a couple, everyone's on the same page, because the operational client, the patron, and the user client becomes one. And so we have to, I think, really be mindful. For me, this was a big revelation in the process of writing the book and reflecting about what succeeded and why, and what failed and why. And therefore, this is related to the notion that, we all have spheres of concern. We are concerned about inequity and social justice and poverty and climate change even, but our sphere of influence diminishes. So as our sphere of concern expands, our sphere of influence diminishes. So, we have dinner with friends and we can discuss how we can change the world, and we go to bed and get up in the morning and we are working out the details for a toilet that has to be added at an auntie's house, and so it's completely demoralizing, right? And so we've all gone through the process. And I think there are many ways one can actually calibrate and make these sort of balances so that we can, begin to bring together our sphere of concern and our sphere of influence. Because if we don't have that instrumentality and don't have that voice in society, we are irrelevant as a profession, at least of architects. And the last thing I want to say is that, I've often been asked these questions, and why do you spend so much time writing, etc. And for me, practice actually follows research, because I've seen that in many cases, people say, oh, I've got a project, it's a project on X, and I'm going to research that, housing or, whatever the institution might be, or, Now, that's fine. That's part of the brief. That's how you understand the brief. That's not research. Research is asking the questions independent of a monetary or a project-linked agenda. Research must be independent. Research helps us think about the context of the context. Practice must actually follow the impulses of what your research tells you rather than the other way around. And therefore, then books, writing, they become instruments of advocacy, because, when you have advocacy or we advocate for something, if we see ourselves as a bridge practice, then our alignment is with civil society. And civil society is that middle ground of people like all of us and many others. Trade unions are part of civil society that have the ability, you might agree or disagree with their aspirations, but they have the ability to negotiate with more powerful and weaker forces, which means they have the empathy for the grassroots, which is people who are marginalized, people who are unrepresented, but they also have the wherewithal through education or savvy or whatever to negotiate with more powerful forces, right? And in that space of civil society where I think we should be more conscious we belong, then advocacy is one aspect of it. But if you don't have the instruments for advocacy, you can't advocate. Then it becomes a situation where you know what to do, but you don't have the instruments to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of our education in the academy often reduces the preparedness of the professional to equipping them with procedural knowledge, not knowing, but not being able to act or to do. And so books is a contribution we can make because it can facilitate people, or when I say books, I mean research broadly, because it becomes instruments of advocacy. I just want to end with this idea of the extension. And so following this book, and I, just taking this platform to also announce the new book, which will be out on the 3rd of September, look out for that. The CCF in Goa is going to do the book launch. It is, so like the Working in Mumbai was a book which looked at 30 years of building and projects, but interspersed with other activity. This book is just looking at writings and research over 30 years. So again, in a sense, it's a complement and it's a second cousin, like architecture in India was a twin to Working in Mumbai, but the Kinetic City and other essays is like a first cousin. But I think many of you who are here might enjoy it. So I just wanted to flag that out for you. And with that, Ranveer, Meera, Prakriti Foundation, I want to thank you for this opportunity. Really enjoyed doing this. And thank you everyone who's here. I know there are many friends too for listening to this rather long presentation. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rahul. That was wonderful. Because it's a webinar and we don't have a sound control, but I can hear a lot of audio hand claps. And so thank you very much. That was really quite a lot in quite a short time. I'm going to start with the questions and then take some from the Q&A. And I want to go back into the past before you started your practice, where you interned in the practice of Charles Correa. I would like to ask you how much of that was an influence and continues to be an influence, because clearly it was somebody who you were closely connected with. And how does that Korean legacy, if there is such a word, continue in your practice?
Well, Ranveer, thanks for that question. And it needed you to ask a question like that. So thank you for asking it. But, in many ways, and I think in this new book, The Kinetic City, I have really acknowledged that whole, what one learned from that legacy, from studying Claude Backley, from many others. But let me focus on Charles Correa. And I think for me, I studied at CEPT. In CEPT, the pedagogy was very much influenced by the Kahnian tradition. And I would say, in a strange way, not the Corbusian tradition so much for some reason. We were obsessed with served and servant spaces, and plan diagrams were given much more premium over volumetric dispositions, which is what Corbusier's work is much richer in. And in a sense, even though I studied in Ahmedabad, it was a time when, Doshi wasn't really involved in the school, because when I joined in 76, I think he had stopped teaching. So I must have seen him once or twice in the 5 years I was there. Maybe that had to do with it. But for some reason, the Corbusian traditions for me were completely lacking. Now I look at it in retrospect, and it's something I'd like to reflect about a little more with my colleagues at CEPT. It was the Kahnian tradition that was much more omnipresent. And so we never taught in section. I remember we would cut sections and elevations like 24 hours before the juries, right? So when I joined Charles Correa's practice, suddenly what became foregrounded for me was sectional thinking, volumetric thinking, kind of constructing narratives around richer narratives than just the diagrammatic space served in servant spaces around the experience of the building and its broader context. And I think one really kind of began to pick up that method in the time I worked with him. So that was one. The other thing that I believe now in retrospect, one was influenced a lot by was his ability to understand tradition, but not academically, rather intuitively, but be able to abstract it in a way that could be useful in its application as one is building in the contemporary time and world. So his notion of the procession route, his notion of open to sky spaces, his idea of the courtyard, both in its symbolism as shunya and zero, but also in its pragmatic application climatically. I think he had this amazing ability to take rather complex lessons from tradition, but abstract them in ways they were applicable. And in hindsight, of course, one was influenced greatly by that. And lastly, I think in him, I did my undergraduate thesis, which is things I've written about in this new book on looking at the work of Claude Batley, who was a professor at the JJ School, who wrote a lot, who practiced with Gregson Batley King. And then in Charles Correa's practice, of course, one saw it in a much more close-up way, is this sort of simultaneous validity of different forms of practice, whether it was urban design, whether it was thinking about the city, it was about housing, it was about doing institutional buildings, but trying to make all those ideas nourish each other. And that's what I mean by the simultaneous validity of learning. In fact, I'm often asked, what do you specialize in? And I say I specialize in non-specializing because it's actually that kind of, I think for architects, we have to be generalists like that. And like I said, we have to be mindful of our place as part of civil society, which extends it into us being these bridges between different parts of society, which is what civil society does. And I think that then changes your perspective on what you get from what and what you learn from what and what you want to be engaged with, I think.
Can you share with us a little bit? You had mentioned during your talk that you would talk a bit about your patrons. And it's important because there are young architects and it is becoming a competitive profession. How does a young architect start? I mean, today you have a practice which has many verticals from conservation, you have time for advocacy, you're teaching, and you have a practice based in Boston and in Mumbai. But for a starting point for a young architect, the initial few years for a patron, for the architect to in fact gain confidence himself in the work that he's doing and in some of the issues that you talked about. Can you just share your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I'll start by saying that, patrons, I mean, you can't be sitting in your office waiting for someone to knock on your door. It has to be a more proactive process. And that's what I mean once you imagine yourself. So you can imagine yourself as a professional that people will come out and seek. That's the wrong foot to start on. But if you imagine yourself, as I'm saying, I'm sorry to be repetitive, as part of civil society, then you go seek the problems, right? And you seek the problems. Then, of course, there is an economic dimension. It's how do you sustain if you're going to seek the problem? But if you seek a problem, then the range of potential patrons expands tremendously, right? So if you seek a problem on the street you live in that you want to fix, for example, which you think as an architect you can imagine, you could be a real activist and put together a society group that raises the money to do that, or you could go to a foundation to ask for that. And so we have to also, that's why I like that idea of taking the client and deconstructing it, because then it opens up the possibility of who are the clients. It's not just someone who wants to build a house and that you try to use your social network to get another house to do and all of that. But it's the other way. It's the same way as I said, the practice must follow research. The research mustn't follow opportunistically the practice. And I think these reversals, therefore, what is the architecture of practice? Not think about the practice of architecture, right? And so it is a matter of seeking out. It's a matter of identifying the problems. It's a matter of, therefore, then putting this together. And I think we are trained to do that. That's what society invests in us to do. So that is, I think, one very broad piece of advice. The other would be that I think And I remember I was invited to do a keynote talk for NID a few years ago. Jayashree Lalba had invited me. She was on the board then. And I remember speaking there, and I felt, my God, what I was beckoning the young designers to do was saying, don't get caught in the vortex of mega cities. There is so much intellectual capital concentrated in our big cities for various reasons, because, most people who study architecture and design come from middle class, if not upper middle class backgrounds. They have a certain level of comfort that they desire, all the way from good broadband internet connectivity to, being able to use their parents' car or whatever. But we have to go and seek out places too. And, India is exploding in its small towns. We have to find other venues. Now, a young person can't just throw up everything and, go in and camp somewhere. And this is where I think the Council of Architecture, Institutes of Architects, academies must create infrastructure to support the schools of architecture, all concentrated in the big cities, must have little out stations in smaller growing towns where there's infrastructure in the form of a YMCA that can be provided, that young architects could go. And if young architects went and seeked out these places, and there are 30, 40, 50,000 transitioning settlements in India. There are a few thousand places that you will not even be able to name if I asked you to list them. These are the places we have to seek. And I think collectively, we have to seek the patrons who might help us go to those places. And so I think it's what I'm saying is maybe too ambitious, but unless we think at that scale, I think our impact as professionals, or our contribution to society as professionals, will be negligible.
I'm going to collapse a few questions. There is one from Peter Griffin, who wants to know about, well, he has three questions, but I'm going to take one because this is really connected with conservation. And his question is, how would you make heritage buildings more accessible to people with disabilities, given the restrictions on what modification laws allow, and perhaps about building accessibility in general? And another question, which is from Yusuf Rahman, who asks, while working on conservation, is it important to ensure that the interventions done are reversible? And I'd like to add to that, you've done so many conservation projects, written about it, and have been part of the conservation movement in many ways. How important is conservation? You touched at it in your talk on the book about, how we see it not as sort of colonial history, but how we see it as our legacy and how we interpret those buildings. And with that, we also seem to have two groups in at least urban India, those who are very pro-conservation and those who believe that it's all okay and this is old history and it's part of sort of, building the new. And where does one sort of engage at the intersection of where conservation is important and what do we do to build new stuff?
Ooh, there's so many things there. The first two parts of those two questions you said are, they are very site specific. To generalize responses there would be a mistake, which is to say, how do you make it accessible for disabled? Of course, you can now. There are different societies, there are different cities, there are different countries that have more draconic and less draconic attitudes to how that can be done. But there are enough precedents of that now globally where people have done that. I mean, every building in Boston, I know, which is a heritage building, every building on our campus here, the university, is all accessible and done in beautiful ways, even how ramps are integrated within the landscape, etc. So, I mean, I think that it's a site-specific problem. So I don't want to go that way because it's a discussion in itself. But you've sort of asked two broader questions, but to that I'm going to also add on my own whim a question that someone has put up there is, where did one go to seek out these patrons when one was starting practice? Manish Chakrabarti has put it on, and he put it on caps, so because it was such a loud question, I said I can't ignore it. So look, I'll just bundle these together. So Manish, I think to your question first, I'm sorry to identify the questioner because you're not doing Ranveer. Oh, you did, Peter, yes. So I didn't break the rule here. Manish, I mean, look, everything we did at the Kala Ghoda area was we seeked out those patrons. No one came and knocked and said, we want to restore the Kala Ghoda. We said, the question we asked after the legislation came, was what is the contemporary engine that might drive the change. And then we realized that art was emerging there. So we went and met gallery people. We went and met, people from the Tata companies who had offices there. We met people from the Jahangir Art Gallery. We met people who had restaurants there. We put a coalition together. They raised the money. The Hong Kong Bank then stepped in. So it was people who came in around a common purpose, the Gandhian phrase, find purpose and the means will follow. So it's the definition of purpose that is very important. And the question we really asked ourselves, because after legislation for 2 years, nothing happened. Everyone was very content legislation had happened, right? But we therefore asked the question, what is the contemporary engine that would drive conservation? And therefore, I think whether it's a street outside your house that you want to transform, or it's a decaying heritage building like many that you're involved with that you want to transform, they are different constituencies that would support it. So therefore, then the question of how does one make this sort of fine line, as I understood, between the, and that's why I use the word constructing significance, because I think for conservation, especially in post-colonial, conditions like Mumbai, how does one drain the symbolic ideological content of the building and imbue it with a new life and meaning? And therefore you construct the significance, because we are taught otherwise that you go to a site, you discern the significance and you kill yourself to reinforce the significance. Sometimes that significance has no resonance within a population. But then the architect's job becomes even harder, because what you're grappling with is a whole recycling of meaning, but keeping the illusion of the architecture intact. Now, that narrative can be built in many ways. It can be built in a very pragmatic way, which is resources, sustainability, embodied energy, disruptions to urban fabric, etc., which is why when at least I was involved with the heritage conservation movement in Mumbai in the early years, I found that most agencies and foundations and organizations involved in conservation were using only nostalgia as the instrument to create those narratives. Oh my God, no, Edward and so came here and so did that. It meant nothing to the local population. I didn't even know that genealogy. So finally, I personally was very much attracted to the Bombay Environmental Action Group, which was Shams Chainani and that group, because they were objectively looking at legislation and saying, what are the problems? And for us in the Fort area, there was a very simple thing we discovered, which is that all the buildings in the Fort area consume 5 and 6 FSI because they come up to the pavement and they go 4 or 5 stories high. Whereas the prevailing FSI in the Fort is 1.33. So it's in no one's interest to demolish a building, because if they demolished a building, what they'd get is 1/3 the area to build on, right? So we were playing up aspects like that, not the nostalgia of where Queen Victoria went, it didn't make any sense to our community, at least to me. And so these alignments and the ways, but then your task as an architect becomes challenging, because then you walk a very fine line, and therefore that's when I think writing, research, all that becomes instruments for advocacy. And even if I may say it, and I can say it now with distance, because that was a 20-year-old phase in my life, is if I wasn't writing so much on Mumbai, if I wasn't being considered as someone who had an understanding of the history of Mumbai, I might not have been able to walk that fine line between trying to drain these buildings of their complete symbolic and use functions and imbue them with new uses. Correct. So it's also the confidence that you build with these constituencies around, and so I think it all comes together in that way. And these reflections you'll find in the essays that I've written. Sorry, Ranveer, that was very long as a response.
Not at all. It's fascinating to see it from different perspectives. You've also done very large projects like the Hathigao, the Office for Novartis, which you shared with us. So when you move from sort of independent, what you call, what we would see as indulgent single home architecture, to larger institutional sort of work, how do you have that flexibility in your practice? Does the practice expand during the time of that project? And how do you then, because of the number of people that you're working with or collaborating with and different agencies, how do you bring in the element, which is very evident in most of the work that you have done and shared with us, a level of what personally I see as a subtext of empathy for and with the project and client?
Well, that's a really good question, Ranveer. And I think what we have very early on decided was to keep the the practice very tight. And that really came out, to be quite honest, from the contingencies that a city like Mumbai offered. And that's why I call the book Working in Mumbai, because it's really autobiographic in some ways, that the city generates your practice, but it also contains it in some ways. And to be absolutely pragmatic, for the first 10 years, we couldn't even afford more than 300 square feet of space. And even now, we are not, we can't have more than 14 or 15 people in our studio space. And so part of that forced us very early on to get into models of collaboration. So when we did the site management plan for the Taj Mahal, for example, we just started a whole new entity called the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborative, which lasted for 10 years. It had Amitabh Beg, Annabelle Lopez, Priyalin Singh. It had many people, Naveen Piplani, many people who were part of it. And we had our own letterhead, own identity, own accounts, and it worked. And when the project was over, we shut it down. The Bombay Collaborative was another such case. For a project in Goa, we did a Goa 2100 kind of entity. So we collaborate a lot in terms of those expansion. Now that does 2 or 3 things. One is those collaborations are done with people who have either locationally a better pulse of the site or are equipped in their own expertise to be part of their site. So therefore, it's it's like a stethoscope. You have to extend what you're capable with through collaborations with others to get that pulse. Then it's a matter of how you read it or not. But I think in that motion, collaborations are very critical. So I mean, the building in Switzerland, for example, not only did we collaborate with an architect locally, but the number of consultants, because their laws are very draconic on many things. There were over 25 consultants. So it was, groups of 30 people. We were actually used to have our meetings in a little mini auditorium because there were so many people involved. But therefore, then one has to learn to do that. And therefore, you play another kind of role. Yes, of course, you think the design through in terms of the synthesis of the different forces that the client offers you to solve. But then you also depend on people, and acknowledge those contributions. And therefore, sometimes one makes, like the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborators, also to dissolve the identity of just RMA Architects, because everyone else's contributions were equally important. And otherwise, we kind of, land up pushing our own brand, so to speak.
In India, it's become very important, or for certain kinds of clients, it's become exceedingly important to follow Vastu traditions in the way that they would want their homes built or their offices situated. And as a sort of contemporary architect, I'm sure you find it a challenge between what you want to design based on the specificity of the site, light, and so forth, and then sort of melding that with Vastu elements. Can you share with us some of those challenges?
Yes, this is a question I could speak for far. But look, my simple. I'm going to do a one-line answer, and then I'm going to just tell you a story. And the one-line answer is that I just treat it as part of the brief, and I've come to recognize that, right? The longer answer to that story is that after I just graduated, I was approached by I'd done my first talk in Mumbai, which was about the reclamations in the city of Mumbai, and somebody, and I'm not going to name people here, asked me to send that to the Taj magazine to publish it, the Taj Hotel. And I thought, well, I never heard of the magazine, but I published it. It was good. It was the least scholarly venue that I have published in. But anyway, as a result of that, someone pretty high up in the hotel group summoned me to their home and said they want me to do a research project, for which they would fly me to Hyderabad, to Chennai, to da-da-da-da-da. And I was just starting my practice. It was the most luxurious offer I had even got. I mean, we were doing a couple of interiors here and there and being put up in 5-star hotels. And the research project was to come up with a 5,000-word article on the importance and relevance of Vastu. Because this hotel was trying to justify the crores of rupees they were spending in retrofitting their hotels because of Vastu that weren't doing well. Anyway, I had a luxurious 6 months of travel and interviewing Vastu practitioners and industrialists who had broken factory buildings and relocated them from one end to the other, and Vastu practitioners who had predicted Rajiv Gandhi's assassination because his bed was in the wrong place, etc., etc., etc. And I came back and I had to sum up all my guts to go back to this big honcho in the touch to tell them that this is something I'm absolutely not going to do. It's just mumbo jumbo. It's just terrible, etc. It's a money-making racket. And I, of course, I was disbarred from going back into that hotel for a long time. Go 5 or 10 years later, and some strange set of coincidences results in 75% of our work being in Chennai. And except for the client of the corner house, everyone else were adamant about even the WCs being oriented by Vastu. And so I kind of got a dose of Vastu in kind of an extreme, and therefore one had to treat it as part of the brief, right? Now, to look at it more rationally, I think, I think Feng Shui has tended to stay a little more rational in the way it talks about wind directions and things. And I think Vastu also, in its origins, I think is incredibly objective, scientific, because one studied in great detail on the east, the kitchen to get the morning sun, the southwest to get the breezes, the highest point, etc., etc. I mean, there are many things there which I don't want to get into. But I think what happened in Vastu versus Feng Shui is Vastu got codified through religion. And therefore, the high priests became custodians of this. And then you had distortions that began to, and you had corruption. So people, could begin to manipulate it in some ways. And so even now you have Vastu practitioners who sometimes they say things that are very sensible. Sometimes I fall off my chair when they say things. And so it's I think got distorted. I wish it could be brought down to its essential principles, which could be publicized a little more. Now there's a loophole for everything. So it's a game of loopholes. You want to get over that, you want to put your swimming pool in that corner, okay, then do this, So it's business, unfortunately. I'm sure there are people who practice it purely. I'm sure there are people who believe in it. I'm sure there are people whose lives have changed in it, and I completely respect that. But I have become more objective about it, and I treat it, because I respect that, I treat it as the brief. I treat it as much as 3 bedrooms and this, that, and the other, that I want my bedroom on the southwest, or I want my staircase going anti-clockwise. That's fine. And I'm proud to say, actually, all the way from the corporate office in Coimbatore to everything we've done in Chennai, including high-rise buildings, meet these Vastu requirements, I believe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Dharmesh Jadeja, who has his practice based out of Auroville, asks, what and how would you personally see or define a fine blending of opposites in Indian design? And I want to club that with a question by Yash Redij, who asks, can you elaborate on the part where you said modernism is not the only way to see the contemporary?
So Dharmesh's question, I'm reading it now, is, well, I mean, I'm not sure if he's asking for me to give examples of this. If he is asking me, then Dharmesh, Golkund for me is a great example right away there at the ashram at your doorsteps. And if it's the same Dharmesh as I'm thinking, then I think a lot of work that you're doing is also, I think, symbolic of that. And I don't want to start now listing architects and buildings, but I think you get what I mean. So Dharmesh, I'm going to leave it on that, but I'm happy to connect with you later and discuss all this in great detail. And the second question, remind me, Ranveer,
is from Yash Redij, who wants you to elaborate.
Yeah, modernism.
Modernism is not the only way to see the contemporary.
Correct. So, so therefore, what is modern and what is contemporary are 2 different categories, right? Just as the words suggest. I think what happened in India is, I mean, there was a moment when, I mean, again, this is very much articulated in detail in architecture in India since 1990, so I don't want to use up everyone's time. But essentially, I mean, I think with India gaining independence, there was a moment where a conscious decision, so to speak, was taken to patronize modern architecture for various political reasons, because it allowed India to construct a pan-Indian identity, which was very necessary at independence, rather than regional identities and a fracture, because it was the idea of a nation state, so it had to be cohesive. And so, I think CORB did that by default. just his selection. And even his selection was a series of accidental encounters that led to it. And I think Nehru recognized that and saw the power in it. And in his own way of justifying it, I think stumbled upon a very interesting identification with what could be the architecture of a pan-Indian identity. It also coincidentally or by default aligned with the simplicity of Gandhi, right? Sans ornament. So it wasn't the frugality of Gandhi, but it picked up and resonated aesthetically. So many things combined there. And, you know, they were opposing tracks there all the way from what Tagore was talking about in Shanti Niketan. There's a whole history there, and there's scholars who've written about it in much greater and with much greater expertise than I can ever do. But but now what happens in India is you then have a second generation of the first generation of Indian architects who are very deft and very talented and skilled at taking that modernism and actually situating it, right? And developing the narratives of how you can root it. And this is what I meant when I alluded to Charles Correa's ability to abstract the aspects of tradition, but yet make it resonate within a contemporary or a modern vocabulary, so to speak. Now, when you go to from the West, which is who have perpetuated this sort of extension, they tended or chose to only see, and they yet continue to, and I don't want to get into this because I'll set up a whole lot of controversies, but they yet continue to do that. That means they recognize things in India that either go one extreme and fetishize the vernacular, or that mindfully extend the modern tradition, right? So you have a whole generation. So it becomes a lens that our pedagogy, our impulses as architects tend to reinforce. And so when I was doing architecture in India, I was just looking at the landscape around me, which I had been part of for 20 years. And I said, how do I explain Akshardham? This is the biggest project of architecture happening. Or how do I situate Laurie Baker in this and the whole tradition in a way? And, you know, I think Dharmesh's question actually alluded to that, because what was emerging in Kerala and Pondicherry were kind of different kinds of experiments, right? In some ways, Golkund was the first modern building even before Cobb, right? So I was trying to make sense of, you know, how do I look at a glass building, and how do I look at Akshardham, and how do I look at the Vipassana Pagoda in Mumbai? These projects that were unmodern, that used unmodern images, were the biggest commissions in the country, and they had no architects involved, because architects were stuck in a very small track of either being very modern or being very aligned to the vernacular tradition. So I called it the barefoot architect model, just as a way to symbolize it. I don't mean that literally. And so clubbed between what was global impulses, that is these big glass buildings that SOM just emails some drawings and someone builds, and on the other hand, Akshardham, the Vipassana Pagoda, hundreds of temples like that. We were commissioned in the middle with very small commissions, the modern architects and the barefoot model, which were earthy, which were about climate, about place, some using a modern aesthetic. But I would argue what comes out of Golkund is very modern aesthetics. It might use crafts, or it might use different materials, and might use compressed mud and adobe, but its sensibilities are modern in the way of the aesthetic influence, right? And so that is then complicated by the idea that actually, therefore, then, like in Turkey, like in Africa, like in Latin America, and Sibel Bozdagon, who's a scholar on this, has written much more, I'm merely quoting her, is in many of these societies, aesthetic modernity arrived before the social modernization process. So there was a great disjuncture. That's why we say, my God, look how badly our modern buildings are being used. No one cares. They add this, that, and because there's a disjuncture. The lifestyles that industrialization in the West gave rise to resulted in an aesthetic of modernity. In our case, modernity came as an aesthetic before the modernization process, you know, whether it's appliances in a kitchen or modes of sitting and grinding things on the floor. It's completely disjunctural to the aesthetic, the spatial sensibility, as well as the aesthetic. So these are all explored in great detail in architecture in India. Sorry.
There's a comment by a cultural commentator, a friend of mine called Sadanand Menon, when we once asked him about the contemporary in the performing arts, and I think it would be true also in architecture, when he said that really looking at the contemporary is looking at things critically. And to add to that, what you said about the context and the context of the context. So if we were to look at that, that itself would allow you to situate in what modernity or what lens of modernity you are looking at that particular period of time.
Totally. Totally. In fact, I mean, I think when one is taking the context and placing it in its context, it's exactly these intersections, this intersections about modernity, the intersections about the urbanization of poverty, the questions of what neoliberalism means in terms of an aspiration, the notion of transitions, which again, another colleague of mine, Eve Blau, talks about, where she describes, transitions don't happen overnight. So when in 1992 we said we're liberalizing our economy, in many people's head, including many parts of the government, it was like a switch. No, now we are a capitalist society, we were a socialist society. But she argues that these transitions take decades to happen. So she argues that for decades you will transition out of socialism, and for decades you will transition into capitalism. But even the end result will not be a clean one or the other. It will be something else, which we can already see happening in India in the way the state is coming back to claim space in many areas, right? And so for someone like my practice, I was trained in the values of socialism, but I start my practice where the values that surround me are all very capitalist and individualistic and neoliberal. Therefore, how does one situate one's practice? So therefore, those become the questions of the context of the context.
And leading on to that, could you share with us a little bit about your latest exhibition on sanitation in the cities? Because it's very much kind of furthering what you just said about, where the state is moving and transitioning, and yet perhaps it is not really delivering.
Right. So it's an exhibition and a research that one has been doing over now 2 or 3 years. It's a book. We're waiting for a sponsor to be able to publish it, because it's not academic, but it's got a lot of research which looks at Swachh Bharat. It looks at, basically the book is titled Sanitation as Infrastructure. And the argument in the book is that sanitation is not just about doing public toilets, but it's about understanding a much broader ecology, including the role of women, including other forms of health and hygiene and public health, or water. And the book tries to make an interrelationship between this, basically tries to map an ecology of what could be the ecology of sanitation. Therefore, then as architects, if we situate a question or want to make an intervention, we are much more mindful of what all its implications are. So that is really the essence of the work. And the book also has 12 studio projects, which my students did looking at a site in Mumbai, and came up with 12 propositions of how one can look at sanitation in this holistic way beyond the imagination of just public toilets, which has become a numbers game. So essentially the underlying idea there also conceptually was that often, whether it's governments, they think in absolute terms, which means we need 5 million community toilets. So you get a factory, you prefabricate, you take trucks and you drop a toilet outside everyone's home where you can, in the rural area at least. But it can't be looked at like that. It has to be looked at in transitionary terms. That means you have to design the transition to better public health. And the design of transitions is quite different from designing absolutes. And therefore, community toilets then, if imagined as a transition to some better state, then the imagination of that design would be completely different, versus if it's imagined as an absolute solution. So one is attempted here to kind of expand on what is that ecology of sanitation. I didn't show that book because we don't know when it'll be out, but hopefully soon.
At the end of the book, you've talked about several of your projects. And while going through that, there are many that have not seen the light of day. For a practice, how disappointing is that when you don't see a project come to light, because a whole team has worked on it, X amount of energy and resources have gone into it? And what are the sort of learnings from that for projects that don't take off?
Many ways, one. But look, when people come to our office, we have these racks with lots of models, and I describe it as a graveyard of projects, because most of those models, there are projects that have not happened, and actually that's very nice. So of course, initially one was full of disappointments, but very quickly one learned that the ideas are more important, which means actually sometimes a project prepares us for another project. As in the same way as Glenn Murcutt once told me, the Australian architect, he said, and I've written about this in the book, he says, every client you select determines your next client. And so it's the same way with projects. When you, I think when something gets unbuilt, those ideas, you're more ready to take those ideas forward. And of course, you have to find the right host for those ideas. And so if one looks at it in that spirit, it actually is a productive process, because sometimes either the client wasn't ready for the project, or you weren't ready for the project, and the client decided to either go to another architect or change it, or change their brief, which you might have, or sometimes and this is very hard, and this one has only been able to do in the last few years. Earlier, of course, one never thought of it like this, but sometimes when a client comes to us, we realize there isn't a project, and we are actually convincing the client to think about the problem differently. And that has happened. It's happened in a number of cases, some of which are yet unbuilt. So I think with a little more experience and confidence, you also can advise the client whether something is a project or it's just something that is a fictitious part of it's just something they've imagined which might not have wings. So I think if one pays more premium to the ideas, which I think, at least in our little studio, everyone has understood. And so I think the kind of disappointments you describe actually don't occur. They used to in the first few years of the practice, naturally.
That's wonderfully optimistic and positive. And I think we're going to now close with the last question that I have with you, which is that you have a full-time teaching assignment at Harvard right now. And how does your engagement with students, their challenging you, their interactions with you versus what you are sharing with them, work or influence the process of your practice?
Many ways, Ranveer. But I can again go on this question, but I would just say this, that I think I came into teaching very late. I started teaching, 20 years after I'd practiced almost, or 15 years or 16 years. So I'm a very late academic or a very late teacher. But I feel really blessed to do it. And I kick myself sometimes for not having done it sooner. There was Sen Kapadia, who was someone who had really was upset finally with me, but he was someone who really tried to and I think about Sen's words, and I wish I had engaged earlier. But, I think the greatest joy is communicating, meaning is taking feelings, experiences. I could have never written this book if I hadn't been teaching, because this book comes out of one being forced to explain ideas to students, and therefore articulating it sometimes to people from other cultures, sometimes to people from completely different generations apart. And I think that reiterative process of articulating and re-articulating actually creates a form of clarity, which is very important. And for me, that is the biggest blessing. And sometimes I really honestly think whether, and I ask myself, am I learning more than they are learning? I think I'm sometimes learning more than they're learning from me speaking, because those reflections allow you to connect the dots in many ways, in different venues. And I think that's the most pleasurable aspect of it.
Thank you so much, Rahul. It's been just fantastic listening to you, talking with you, and to the audience for having participated. We've had a really interesting group of people, lots of students, lots of other people interested in architecture and the arts. So thank you all for being here. Thank you once again, Rahul, for your time, your energy, and this incredibly inspiring time where you've had the time to share with us what your journey has meant. Thank you so much.